It is a big privilege and a big honor to talk with Mr. David Rooney, the author of an extraordinary book about time, a history of civilization in 12 clocks. Thank you very much for accepting this interview, David Rooney.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
My first question is this one. Where did you get this passion, this fascination for clocks? Since when, actually?
Actually, from a very young age. I was just 8 years old when my parents decided to change their careers and to set up a business making and restoring old clocks. So my parents had been teachers, and as I say, I was 8 years old. They decided to leave teaching, set up a clockmaking business. So from then on, for the next 10 years, until I went to university at the age of 18, I kind of grew up with clocks all around me in the house where the business was carried on from. So I had like the sound of clocks and the sound of time, but also I heard all of the stories that my parents would discuss about what those clocks meant in history, but also what they meant to their owners. And so that always stuck with me, that clocks themselves are remarkable, but also every clock has a story. And it's that really fascinated me.
Do you have many watches?
Personally, I've never really collected watches or clocks. I ended up in a career working in museums, at the London Science Museum and at the National Maritime Museum, which is in Greenwich, which has the Royal Observatory. So I was working for like all my career with some of the most remarkable watches and clocks that have ever been made. I couldn't compete with my own collection, so I've just been privileged really to be able to get my hands on some of the finest ever made. I have a few watches, not too many.
What is your favorite watch from all around the world?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's in many ways a difficult one to answer because there are so many and each one is different. But and I could give you an answer like, you know, the first marine chronometer made by John Harrison in 1759 that allowed maritime navigation to be very much safer. It enabled empires to be built, and the course of history was changed. I could tell you about any kind of watch like that, but actually the watch that I care about most is a very cheap watch that my mother bought, a Swatch watch that my mother bought, and she wore it all the time. And then when she passed away, I inherited that watch along with others. And, you know, when I put that on my wrist, it connects me with her, right? So because I mean, she wore a certain perfume. So of course the leather strap smells of the perfume that she wore. It's the face that she looked at. And so when I wear it, it connects me to my mother, to her past. And that's, I think, one of the real powers of watches and clocks, because they live and they're close to us and they connect us with people and events and places far away and in the far distant past.
Mm-hmm. It's about the strong and the invisible link, actually. But in the same way, what is your favorite story about clocks? You said that clocks and watches are actually together with stories.
Yeah, and the stories that I wanted to tell in the book about time, what I wanted to do was to zoom out and move away from rigid categories like clocks, watches, sundials, whatever. And I wanted to look at all of the ways that we've kept time or made sense of the passage of time. And actually, it's a story that I start the book with, and it's a story that's 2,300 years old, which is the story of the first sundial that was installed in public in Rome, in the Roman Republic, the year 263 BCE, Rome's first public sundial, and the effect that it had on the population of Rome, not the elite, not the people who ran the Republic, but ordinary citizens, ordinary people. It changed their lives. There was a remarkable quotation written at the time of how people thought about the arrival of a clock in their midst for the first time. It's very short. They said that the gods damn the man who first discovered the hours, who first set up a sundial here, who has cut and hacked my day into smaller and smaller pieces. And he said, when I was a boy, my stomach was the only sundial. It was better than all of these, but now I cannot eat unless the sun says so. Right, so there's a quotation that's 2,300 years old, and it's telling us how we feel today. We can't have our lunch until the clock tells us it's lunchtime. We can't eat it only because we're hungry. And that story just made me think how old our relationship is with clocks, and how some of the feelings that we have with clocks now go back thousands of years. The way we feel about them is nothing new.
Mm-hmm. A little bit philosophical question. When you look at a watch that interests you or even fascinates you, do you ever forget time? Do you feel as you are out of time?
I think it's a philosophical question. It's a profound one, really. I mean, because I've worked in museums all of my life, then the clocks and watches that I've spent most time with are from long ago and from far away. So in some sense, so yes, I feel very out of time when I look at those clocks, because this isn't the time that they were changing the world, right? And it could be hundreds or thousands of years. And I think clocks have the power to do that because they last so long. I mean, they're remarkable machines. But there's another way that I think I did a bit of watchmaking on the side, right? I learned very badly how to take watches apart and put them back together. And one of the things that I noticed when I was doing that, I had a tiny watch in front of me and I was taking it apart, and that my mind was disconnected from the world and from time when I did that. That I was entirely focused on this tiny little device that was ticking, and it disconnected me from time and space. And I think that's how we feel often when we look at watches, that they take us to another time.
We are together with David Rooney and with his amazing book, Despre, timp, about time, a history of civilization in 12 clocks. Do we measure time with our watches, or even more than that, do we manage to catch time with them?
I think that's profound because, and this was really the biggest idea that I wanted to get across in the book. Clocks measure time, of course they do, but they do far more than that. And that idea of capturing time, or rather of humans using clocks to capture time, to perform some act on earth, which is about power. So my argument really is that clocks are a tool for humans to wield power, to control other people, to get order in our human lives, to try to get order in the infinity of the universe. And so when I was looking across all of these clocks, watches, sundials, across time and across space, and seeing what they did besides measure time, that there were some of these really the biggest themes in human history, right? So like morality and faith and virtue, empires, money, power, resistance, even our very identities are all captured in clocks and by clocks. But really, it's what's behind the clocks that interests me, which is people.
Mhm. How did you move from watches to the history of clocks? And another question linked with this, how to do a history of civilization in 12 clocks?
I mean, I've always been interested in history, particularly the history of objects that people have made. Given that I've worked in museums, the history that I'm most interested in is told using objects. So when I started to look at watches and clocks physically, I was looking at their history. So that was kind of the starting point. So, but it's a really good question. How do you move from a history of clocks to a history of civilization? Because this book project actually started as a history of clocks. Mm-hmm. And the more I looked at the history of clocks, the more I realized that I was seeing the history of civilization. Because all of those ideas that were just starting to emerge every time I was looking at another clock, ideas about power, about faith, about morality, and so on, I realized there was something bigger, and that actually clocks were a mirror of civilizations, and by looking at clocks, we were looking at the civilizations that made them.
You have chosen 12 clocks, but a day has 24 hours. What you proposed here in this very beautiful and amazing books, and thank you for having in Romania at Editura Trei publishing the Trei publishing house. What you propose here is a fascinating history, but it is a diurnal, it is a luminous, lightning history that you propose, or especially is a nocturnal, a dark history here?
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, 12 clocks, but the day has 24 hours. I think the answer is that it's both. It's both that bright daytime, luminous, positive history, but it's also the darker side of history, the nocturnal side, absolutely. But I mean, that's the two sides of human existence, really, isn't it? And I hope that this comes across in the book, that it would be very easy, I think, to tell a very positive history of clocks. They have done remarkable things for human civilization. They've changed the world in very positive ways. But if I was to leave it there, I would be neglecting some of the darker sides to clocks. Because there are winners and losers in history. And so, for instance, one example is the role of clocks in the building of empires. I mean, I focused particularly on the European maritime empires of the 16th to the 20th centuries. And clocks are really significant in how those empires were built and managed. Now, lots of people have lots of different views on the history of empires, but I think it's fair to say, and surely everyone would agree, that there was a dark side to empires that we need to be aware of. And so my serious answer to your a very good question is that I wanted to look at the brightness and the darkness of civilizations using these clocks.
How can you argue elegantly that the story of the time is actually and deeply the story of us, of people?
Yeah, and there are two big stories that I don't talk about, and I never really talk about. One of them is what time is, which I think philosophy thinks a lot about. There's how time works, which I think is what physicists and scientists think about. Now, I'm no philosopher, I'm not a scientist, so I leave those questions to others. The third question is the one that interests me. What clocks mean, which is to say, who has made them and why through history. And by looking behind the clock to see who made it, why did they want that clock to be made? And it comes back to that earlier question you asked, which is, are clocks just measurement instruments, or are they doing something more than that? So I think when we look at time and look at what clocks mean, it's absolutely about us. It's absolutely about humans, because we made the clocks. We did so for reasons much more than just to know the time of day.
Mm-hmm. Is the story of the clocks mostly one of freedom, one about freedom, or mostly one of tyranny? And are the clocks freer in democracies or in constitutional monarchies than in dictatorship or various authoritarian political systems?
Very important question. Freedom or tyranny?
Yes.
I think it depends who you are,
mm-hmm.
as to whether clocks have been acts of freedom or of tyranny. And I mean, it depends who you are in history. As I've said before, there are people who win and there are people who lose. So it's both. And it's to do with the power structures of civilizations. Some people are more powerful than other people. And when you look at the history of clocks, you can see that. However, I'm absolutely not saying that clocks are devices which we have to submit to. They're not tyrannical devices that are always trying to enslave us. So there's a very strong theme also in the stories that I tell in the book about resistance. Resistance to the power that people want to enact over us with clocks. Now, there's a series of stories that I tell about how people fight back against that power. I mean, some of those are very violent acts. I tell a story from the late 19th century about how a group of anarchists in France and England tried to set a bomb at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, which was the single place on Earth that measured time for the whole world. Greenwich Mean Time. It's the basis today of all time zones. You might be several hours away from Greenwich Mean Time, but it is still the time on that meridian measured in that building. No longer it's a museum, but on that line, which set the time for the world. Now, those anarchists in the 1890s felt that that was a monstrous act of global power to say the whole world must march to the beat of this country, England, and this clock in the observatory. So they decided to set a bomb. The bomb was exploded, but accidentally, and the person carrying the bomb was killed. But then there were other examples. Suffragettes in Scotland campaigning for votes for women bombed an observatory in Edinburgh. In Bombay, in India, in today's Mumbai, a clock right at the heart of the city was attacked. The dials were shot by rifles in an act of resistance against the British government that was enacting very repressive measures on the native Indian population. And symbolic of the British rule in India was this clock made by Britain, the mechanism made in London, and installed right at the center of Bombay, facing the police station, the British police station. So what an act of resistance it was to attack the clock, because it symbolized the British rule in India. So, are clocks about freedom or about tyranny? I think they're about both. And people have often resisted the tyranny of the clock. But the question about democracies or authoritarian political systems, very, very interesting. I'd like to see a difference in the way that clocks are used in one compared with the other, but I don't. An example that came immediately to mind was, an example that came to mind that I think was quite significant is time in China. And in 1949, when Mao Zedong came to power in China, and the new capital of Beijing, which is quite far in the east of China, was established, one of his first acts was to unify all time in China. Now, China is like 5 hours of time wide, huge country, of course, and yet from 1949, there's been only one time, and it's Beijing time. And that was a very deliberate act by Mao Zedong to say, well, to unify the nation, but to say the power in this country is now Beijing. So you may live in the west of China, and the time by the sun is nothing to do with the time by the sun in Beijing, but the time on your clock will be the same. And this was a deliberate act. He said at the time that everybody must keep Beijing time because it's a symbol of his power. And the similar things have been done in other countries, but they've been done in democracies just as much. I mean, if you look at a time map of Europe, a lot of Europe is on Central European time. A lot of Europe is on Eastern European time. And if you look at the Central European time zone, it goes from Spain in the west all the way, it's again more than 1 hour wide. And the reason for that, it's to do with unity. It's to do with grouping nations together who care about each other, who want to be connected with each other. So I think the only difference is what kind of power is wielded using clocks. But it's a tool. Some might say it's a weapon that anybody can use, whether in a democracy or in a more authoritarian state.
Mm-hmm. So Mao Zedong as a dictator of time, very interesting perspective and very interesting way. Again, we are together with David Rooney, and it's a great pleasure to have this dialogue. And we are together with his amazing book about time, A History of Civilization in 12 clocks. How can clocks actually become weapons, and how can they be shields or a various form of protection? You answer previous answer of you was a little bit about this actually.
Yeah, because I think it's a theme that runs through most of the stories that I talk about. I think there's a really strong example that many of us will really recognize, which is clocks being used to tell us when we start work and when we finish work. And this idea that goes back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, the idea that we clock on and then we clock off. A clock tells us it's whatever time you start work, 9 a.m., and you have to work from then until 5 p.m. or whatever. So that like the symbol of the clock in the factory or in the office or another workplace, the clock tells you when your time is no longer your own, has been seen as a weapon by historians for as long as that's been the case. That in that case, the clock is a weapon of the factory owner or the mill owner or the boss, that the clock enslaves us. But at the other end of the day, the clock also frees us. It releases us from its tyranny. It gives us a very clear signal that we start work, of course, but we also finish work. And so there's that kind of, I don't know, duality, the two sides of the clock, a weapon, but also a shield, a form of protection against that tyranny, I think comes across in a lot of the stories that I talk about.
Mhm.
Again, it comes down to structures of power in societies, which are complex.
Mhm. How exactly can clocks tell stories about philosophy, about capitalism, about morality, about identity?
Really big themes in history, and I kept seeing those ideas emerge from the clocks that I looked at. One example was when I visited Amsterdam in the Netherlands to see a clock hidden away in a church. But originally it had been installed at the world's first stock exchange, which was in Amsterdam, built in the year 1611. And it was the clock that sounded the birth of capitalism. If capitalism is in many ways based on markets and buying and selling, and in the case of stock exchanges, buying and selling financial products, financial trading started there, and it was controlled by that clock that I went to see. So that clock was a regulator, regulating the trade of stocks and shares from the year 1611. That got me really interested in what role do clocks play in capitalism today, right? In the trading exchanges of modern capitalism, where billions or trillions of dollars are being traded, making some people very rich and making quite a lot of people quite poor. And I found that it was all still done with clocks, and that there are clocks embedded in these data centers that people use to trade at light speed these vast amounts of capital. Clocks, just like in Amsterdam in 1611, clocks are still being used to try to regulate that trade. In other examples, you asked about morality, and I talk quite a lot about this. I'm really interested in daylight saving time, the practice of changing the clocks twice a year to move them forward by 1 hour in summer, and then moving them back an hour as winter comes. So in Britain, it's called British summertime, elsewhere daylight saving time. Quarter of the population of Earth change their clocks twice a year. And why do they do it? And it all traces back to one guy in London about 120 years ago who had this moral zeal that people should wake up earlier in summer when the sun had risen. So he was a guy who thought that we would live better lives if we got more daylight. We would get more daylight if we got up earlier in summer. He proposed that we change all the clocks to fool ourselves that we're getting up at the same time, when in fact we get up 1 hour earlier because the clock tells us to. Now that feels like a fairly unimportant idea that one guy in London thinks we should get up early because that's his moral idea. And a century later, quarter of the population of Earth still changed their clocks twice a year because he thought it was a good idea. And we still argue. I mean, in America, the arguments about daylight saving every year are almost violent. So there's an example there of how morality is hardwired into the lives that we live through the clocks that we use. So whether it's capitalism or morality, philosophy, I talk quite a lot about virtue in the book and how the hourglass, the sand glass, is a symbol of living good lives. If you look, for instance, at the banners of groups like Extinction Rebellion today, who are campaigning for us to live better lives on Earth now, well, the symbol is that of a sand glass, a clock, the passage of time. So how can clocks tell these stories? Those stories just started to emerge whenever I was delving into the history of every clock I looked at. And I found it was astonishing, but that's the stories that I wanted to tell.
Mhm. In the 21st century, in the year of grace 2022, do we have the most sophisticated clocks than have existed throughout human history?
Really, what an excellent question. It depends on what you mean by sophisticated. If you mean technically, then yes, absolutely. The clocks that are being made today, the best clocks in science laboratories around the world, they're called atomic clocks. They are so accurate and so precise that if one of those clocks had somehow been built at the start of the universe, the Big Bang, the birth of the universe itself and the birth of time itself, that clock would be wrong today by less than half of 1 second. So they're astonishingly accurate, astonishingly precise, and they enable so many technologies in the world to work. Really, the modern world can only work because of these atomic clocks in laboratories around the world and in satellites over our heads, like the GPS system. But is that sophisticated? So when I look back in history and look at some of the clocks that were made in the Islamic world in the 13th century, clocks twice the size of humans with the most astonishing astronomical and astrological readings, that the stars would rotate like the heavens above. The sun and the moon and the planets would all move at the correct speed. And you would look at these clocks from the 13th century in places like, one I talk about in Diyarbakir, which is today in Turkey. You were looking at the universe. You were looking at the sun and the moon and the stars that were operating exactly like the real universe that you could see with your own eyes. And these were clocks made by humans. Now, when I look at those clocks and think how awe-inspiring they must have been to the people who saw them all that time ago, they're still awesome today. If you visit places like Strasbourg Cathedral or the city of Prague, and you can see these ancient astronomical clocks, they're amazing. So really, the 21st century makes some fantastic clocks, the most accurate ever made. But actually, almost every clock in history, sophisticated, beautiful and in many cases inspiring awe. And that's why I got so excited about writing this book and telling the stories, because we're doing great things now, but we really have always made the most amazing clocks.
The word clock comes from the word bell, klosh, glosh, or klokka. How do you feel that we should be awakened, not by a clock, not by clocks, but by a history of clocks?
Well, many of the stories that I was telling were really positive and wonderful, but some of them weren't. And towards the end of the book, I talk about the role of clocks in war. Unfortunately, this is a subject that is particularly significant today, exactly. And the role of clocks, and I focus particularly on something which sounds very obscure, but I mentioned the satellites above our head, the GPS satellites, which keep your smartphone, tells you where you are. You can navigate in your car using GPS satellite navigation. And all they're really doing is carrying clocks. Those satellites above our heads for GPS are just flying clocks. And they're beaming those time signals down to Earth, and your smartphone is looking for the time signals from several satellites. And by seeing several satellite time signals, it can calculate your position to less than the size of your little fingernail. So these are clocks above our heads. But think about who made those clocks and why. And the clocks of GPS were built by the American military to change war. There are two other major systems of satellites. One is called GLONASS, which was built by the Russian military. And the third is called Beidou, which was built by the Chinese military. Together, those three systems, built by those three countries to change the practice of war forever. We're seeing some of the results right now in the testing times that we're living through. And so it felt important to me to tell that story of how significant those clocks are in the world, how they've changed the world and are changing it, good and bad. All I really wanted to do was to help us all increase our knowledge of the power that clocks can have, because it's really the power that people have using clocks. And so I hoped we would simply awaken our own understanding of these devices so that we can understand them better and hold people to account, ask better questions of our politicians and our leaders to understand why they've made these devices and the power that they have over us. And also, I guess, to think about how clocks might make peace as well as war. I've finished with a couple of very positive stories about clocks which are looking far into the future. Many of the stories are about the past, these ones are about the future. There's a clock being made in America right now which will run for 10,000 years, a mechanical clock that needs to be wound up by humans, and it'll run for that far into the future so that we perhaps make better decisions now, so that that future will really have a civilization in it. And then the final clock that I talked about is a clock which was set running in the year 1970, but it will not be seen by humans until the year 6970, 5,000 years after it was buried under a park in Osaka in Japan. And it's a clock that will run for 5,000 years in a time capsule. And what a message of hope that was, I think, for the future that clock will still be ticking when it's unearthed 5,000 years' time, so people can think about the future, the past, and our place in it.
So, and this is the final question. What question? The time is with us or is against us?
Time's always with us. And we can take back control of time. If other people are trying to control us with time, we can take that control back. I hope ultimately a positive story. Time is always with us.
Mm-hmm. David Rooney, about time, a history, a civilization in 12 clocks. It was really a huge pleasure and a great honor to have this amazing conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a huge pleasure for me, and I appreciate your interest.
Thank you very much.